Thank you, everybody, for joining me this morning. I'm Tony Whitehair. I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent for K-State Research and Extension here in Dickinson County. We're going to do our virtual wheat plot tour because, as everybody knows, we're having a few changes on how we hold our programs here this spring. So I'll give everybody else a chance to introduce themselves here on the call real quick.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I am Romulo Lollato, Extension Wheat and Forage Specialist with Kansas State University, based out of Manhattan.
Good morning. I'm Stu Duncan, Northeast Region Extension Crops and Soil Specialist.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kelsey Anderson. I'm the Wheat and Forage Extension Plant Pathologist. I just started here in the last month or so looking forward to getting to know everyone.
And I'm Eric DeWolf, also a plant pathologist, wheat disease expert there at Kansas State University.
Thank you, everyone. So first, I'd like to say thanks to our cooperating producers and sponsors for the wheat plots. We have Kevin Harris and Harris Crop Insurance, and then Steve Hoover with Hoover Tarp Sales. They've both hosted the plots here in Dickinson County for many, many years. And then also thank you to our supporters from Extension, as well as the Kansas Wheat Alliance. I'm going to go a little bit of background information on the plots. How you see it on the screen as far as the description with the Hoover plot being on the left and Harris plot being on the right. That will match up with the pictures that you'll see on the slides with the individual varieties. So we'll start with the, let's go back one. The Hoover plot, we had approximately an 85-pound seeding rate, was planted November 4th. There was no starter fertilizer on that. Typically that field gets some manure applied to it, but it did not this year. 70 pounds of nitrogen was applied at top dress along with finesse. And a couple notes, we've had some strong storms go through north of Abilene that has caused some of the varieties to be lodged twice, most recently here in the last week, which you will see those in the pictures. With the Harris plot, that was planted on October 18th with a 75-pound seeding rate. 100 pounds of 40 rock starter was applied at planting. They did apply 50 pounds of nitrogen before planting and was worked in, I believe. Another 50 pounds was streamed on around the 1st of March. A little bit later, they applied finesse and MCPE along with another 10 pounds of nitrogen. And then fungicides, they had a 3.5 ounce rate of Nexacor with the herbicide. And then in early May, 7 ounces of Nexacor for stripe rust. So with that, we'll move into Romulo and the crew to kind of give an update on some of the things we're seeing around the state.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tony. It's interesting that you have that slide out there, and I'll take the chance to just make a quick comment here because we see the seeding rates in pound per acre in both cases, and we understand that for demo plots like these, it's probably the easiest way. We keep the same rate across everything, but just a reminder there that more and more we're seeing these varieties vary considerably in their seed size. So if you get a variety that have 10,000 seeds per pound versus a variety that has 15,000 seeds per pound, well, you might have 2/3 of the population that you're intending for if we're not adjusting our seeding rate. Just a quick comment there, and we're going to talk about some of these varieties, their seed size, characteristics as well as we go through. But as Tony mentioned, a quick update there on what we're seeing around the state this year from the wheat crop, right? And starting last fall, through the majority of the state, we were able to get a decent stand establishment, right? There was, for the majority of the state, again, kind of some timely rains there in the fall that allowed for a good stand establishment, with the exception of the southwest part of the state. So in southwest Kansas, we actually, there are several fields that are actually a pretty large region that the crop didn't really come up until sometime in January, right? So in January, February there, it was planted on time, but there was never enough moisture for it to really come up and establish the stand during the fall. That really affects that region because then our yield potentials are essentially cut in half right there. Just because we didn't merge the spring, we might have 50-60% of our original potential. So that was one part of the story. And then through the spring, that drought that was originally in southwest Kansas, it kind of expanded to the north central part of the state as well. So now we have two very important parts of the state that were under drought stress for a very long period of time within the growing season, that being southwest Kansas and north central Kansas as well. So drought stress being a big portion of the story of this year's crop, especially in north central and southwest Kansas. Another big talk that we had this year was some very severe, some very cold temperatures that happened in early to mid-April there. Temperatures were, in parts of the state, got to as low as 8 degrees in northwest Kansas. And so really depending where we were in the state, the crop sustained quite a bit of freeze damage. And so again, probably the worst portion was that central Kansas through north central Kansas. So Phillips and Rooks, that part of the state, probably from Barton County all the way to that portion of the state where we saw a considerable amount of that combination of freeze that was actually worsened by the dry conditions that we had in north central Kansas. Now the crop more in Barton, Ellsworth County recovered quite well because it had enough moisture to recover, but the crop in north central Kansas, it was not actually for the next few weeks that it had some moisture to really start recovering. So probably a little bit of a later crop out there because it suffered from that freeze, right? The late planted crops after soybeans were the ones that got hit the worst, didn't have enough canopy out there. So those cold temperatures really brought the crop back as far as killing some killers, and it didn't have too many killers to start with. In the bigger crop, the one that was planted likely either after a wheat crop or after a fallow period, although usually we would expect more damage on that crop, and it sustained damage to the primary killers, sometimes 30-40% loss of those primary killers. You had enough killers out there to really compensate for that. So we're seeing a little bit less damage on that crop comparatively to a late planted crop. The central and south central part of the state, like from probably Dickinson County, is actually in pretty good shape as we go south all the way to Sumner County and west, all the way really to about Meade County. So the crop is actually in very good shape. It had enough moisture through the season that drought wasn't really a concern as we were talking about southwest, north central Kansas. The freeze didn't really catch the crop because, well, the temperatures were not as low as what we saw in north central, northwest Kansas, so not as much damage from the freeze to that region. So really in a pretty good shape in that portion of the state. One thing that we started seeing develop just in the last week was really large portions of the field turning white, and that's, we can see that it's typically in the low-lying areas of the field, especially flat fields and perhaps have just a little bit low-lying area. And those large portions that are turning white a little bit before everything else, it really seems like in this region, opposite from southwest Kansas, we are seeing some waterlogging really happening and cause large portions of the field to turn white. With that, gives us an indication that moisture was not in deficit in this part of the state, but that also brings some diseases to the table. And so I'll turn to Kelsey here and see if she has an update for us on disease development throughout the state for this season.
Yeah, thanks, Romulo. That was a good update. I think from the disease side of things, you're right. The wet weather, especially on the eastern part of the state, was really favorable for some diseases. I think the biggest story we had in terms of just the number of fields infected and the length of time that we were hearing reports was stripe rust. And I think Tony mentioned this in the intro, that was showing up in some of these demo plots. And we saw that come into the state a little later than typical. So that we'll typically hear reports from Oklahoma, Texas, and then we'll start to get reports of stripe rust in Kansas. And so we started to get those reports this year in late April. And in this part of the state, probably early mid-May, stripe rust started to show up in the lower canopy, and then we started to get reports stripe rust in the mid canopy. And as a reminder, when that pathogen affects the upper leaf, so the flag leaf or flag leaf -1, that's when we can start to see yield loss, particularly when several plants or maybe there's foci or like these portions of plants that become infected. That's when we'll start to see yield loss. So one of the key things about stripe rust this year, although we didn't have the major epidemic that we had a couple of years back, we did see several fields infected, and we did start to see varieties that had typically been resistant or moderately resistant start to have more infection than we would like to see. So those included SY Monument and Zenda. So that indicates that we might be seeing a bit of a race shift. And some of these varieties that were typically controlling the stripe rust populations might not be working as well. So that's something we're keeping an eye on. So like I mentioned, that wet weather was really conducive for some other diseases like septoria and tan spot. Those are the diseases that we will see on the leaves that will cause brown lesions that might all blend together and cause the leaf to die back. And those fungi survive in wheat stubble in the ground. So when it's wet, those spores will splash up and cause infection. And so we were seeing a good amount of those diseases, especially in the central part of the state. One of the other big stories is Fusarium head blight. So it wasn't, we're hearing some reports of specific fields that are having bigger problems, but especially through southeastern Kansas and central Kansas, we are seeing pretty scattered reports of Fusarium head blight. So again, that's a disease that will infect during flowering, and then you'll start to see symptoms 2 or 3 weeks later. So right now, maybe in southern Kansas, it's a little late to start to see those symptoms because they can be just totally masked by a mature plant. But in central Kansas, we're starting to see those wheat heads that have a portion of the head bleached off. So that would be Fusarium head blight. So we're still keeping an eye out for that, and there's still some time to do some scouting. We'll talk about some of these diseases, and particularly some of these varieties today that are showing to be more susceptible than maybe they have been in the past. So we'll comment a little bit more about that when we're going through some of the plot tours today. Eric, did I miss anything on disease?
No, I think that sounds great. Well done.
Okay.
All right, well, we'll move into the varieties that we have in our local plots here.
Excuse me, Tony, I had a question for Romulo. You can edit this out too if you need to, but Romulo, you talked about seed size, and as we look at that, the slide that Tony's got up there, you know, as we are planting these, and we have these larger seeds in some varieties, that planting date, that could be a really critical for some of those, like, and especially if they're a fall tiller and type of wheat or they're not. You know, I think of Everest, and that was one that we never really wanted to plant too early or too late because of that smaller or that larger seed size, and it didn't put its tillers on till it tried to get them all on in the fall, or as many as it could, and that tiller number in the fall is going to be really critical because 60% or better of our yield normally comes from those fall tillers. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah, definitely, Stu.
Because I think that was a really good point you made, and I thought, oh, we could poke that just a little bit more potentially.
Yeah, no, definitely. So essentially, Stu, what you're talking about there. So remember, the later we're planting, the less temperature we're going to have during the fall, right? And with less temperature during the fall, that means less tiller during the fall. So essentially, the wheat crop is going to produce a new leaf, more or less every about 90 degrees Celsius that it accumulates. And for every about 2.5 or 3 leaves is a new tiller, right? So that we can very quickly calculate and very easily calculate to see how much we're actually missing as far as the opportunity for tillering goals. And so because whenever we're planting late, we have less time to tiller, that's why we recommend as you're planting later, increase your seeding rates as well. So if we do a quick example here, right, for example, in the Harris plot there, 75 pounds per acre, that means that if we had 10,000 seeds per pound, that variety was getting 750,000 seeds per acre. Now, if we had 15,000 seeds per pound, that means that variety was probably getting over 1 million or maybe 1.1. I'm not sure on top of my head here, but that's more population that we will be getting in a variety that have 15,000 seeds per pound. So that's the first step that we need to do. It's a variety specific type of, just know the seed size. So we're actually not shortening ourselves in population. And then, as you mentioned, as we're planting later, so for example, the Harris plot planted at October 18th had a full, at least 2 weeks more to tiller out than the Hoover plot. And not only 2 weeks in time, but also in temperature, because those 2 weeks were much warmer than the 2 weeks following the planting of the Hoover plot, which was on November 4th. So again, because the crop has less time to tiller during fall, we need to ramp up those seeding rates. So we're going to rely more on that primary and maybe the first tiller, right? The main stem plus that primary tiller, rather than having 8 or 4 or 5, 6 tillers during the fall, which are more productive. So that's where the compensation comes about, either on the variety seed size, and especially as we plant late as well. That in that situation, planting late, definitely putting out the starter fertilizer is also kind of like to call it money in the bank, because we really see that response on a little bit better fertility early on, that nitrogen and that phosphorus helping out with wheat tillering, which are situations where it kind of warranted to apply some starter fertilizer as we're planting late there. So yeah, good question, Stu. Thanks for bringing it up.
And 15 years ago, that wasn't a big deal because we had just started doing our double cropping anyway, and that is really big in that area north of 56 highway anyway, for sure. And Tony's right in the heart of it. There have been a real shift in how in our farming operations.
We did a recent survey here, and we interviewed about close to 400 fields in north central Kansas, and we saw that 55% of them were after soybeans. So definitely you're right on. I mean, over half, close to 60% actually are going after soybeans. So we're pushing our planting dates. So that becomes a much important decision, is increasing that seeding rate as we go into a later planting.
Thanks, Stu, for bringing that up. So if we're ready, we'll move on to our varieties. So our first one is Everest.
Yeah, so Everest, this one has been around since 2009 and needs no introduction in the region. So it was the most widely planted wheat for several years and holds a good amount of acreage in Kansas. There are several reasons for that success over the years. From an agronomic perspective, maybe some of the things that we can highlight here are that it handles acid soils quite well. So sometimes growers that are on that 5.5 pH or lower, probably in that 5 to 5.5 range, can trust that it's still going to yield quite well despite those low pHs. It has an excellent standability, so great straw strength on Everest here. It's an early maturing variety, and so it allows sometimes to finish the cycle before heat really comes in and kind of takes its toll. But a lot of the things that made Everest successful over the years are actually related to its disease package. So maybe Eric, would you like to give us an overview of what has made it successful over the years and what has changed?
Sure. I think as we look back historically at Everest, it was largely its disease package, like Romulo said, that I think contributed to its durability and success over the years. When Everest first came out, it had some good resistance to leaf rust and the powdery mildew, some of the best available Fusarium head blight and barley yellow dwarf resistance, some resistance to Hessian fly. Now, in recent years, it seems like it's struggled a little bit more on the stripe rust side of things and slipped to be at least moderately susceptible to the stripe rust population that's present right now. And that's really maybe more than anything else what has hurt Everest in recent years, and maybe we've seen it fall out of favor with a lot of growers in central Kansas now because of that. It many times will require a fungicide to keep the stripe rust under control in a big stripe rust year. So overall, pretty solid disease package yet. Some of the best available: Fusarium head blight, barley yellow dwarf, but keep an eye on that stripe rust susceptibility and be willing to use a fungicide. You may be able to get a little more mileage out of Everest yet.
All right, any more comments on Everest?
Well, I think we're ready to go.
All right. Larry.
Stu, want to give us your comments on Larry there?
Absolutely. Appreciate that, Romulo. This was one of our newer releases. It's been out, is it 3 years now? Or two or 3 years. But Larry was one of those, came out the same time as Zenda. Probably, if you're going to plant this one up in Dickinson County, you ought to plan on being ready to use a fungicide application, especially for leaf rust. Larry does, it's got good low pH tolerance. It's a little bit taller and a little bit later than Zenda or Everest. It's kind of in that medium range. Has pretty good straw strength. Had excellent yield potential, probably more down in the Hutch and southern McPherson area on west, but it has done very well. It does not carry all the disease resistance that the Zenda had, at least as far as in Everest have. I mean, Everest is still the gold standard, I think, for Fusarium head blight tolerance, but Larry does not have that advantage. It's pretty susceptible to leaf rust. I'd heard reports, and I'll leave this to Kelsey and Eric, that Larry has had a little bit more stripe rust this year. I did not. I just can't find it in the plots I did down at Lorraine and Romulo. You've seen this too. You guys have covered more of that area south and west there than I have, but it's been a really good yielder. We'll top out a little bit better than Zenda and Everest under those conditions. It'll be one of the better yielders out there, but you've got to watch the diseases on it. And you also, one other thing I like about it is it'll tiller pretty well in the fall, and I think it's pretty decent grazing, dual purpose wheat. And Romulo, I think that's something I want you to fill in on some of these, because Tony, you guys have a moderate amount of grazing up there in Dickinson County.
We do our fair share. I was looking at the latest numbers from, I think it came out this last week, that we're about number 15 or 16 in the state county-wise for cattle numbers. So we do our fair share of grazing on wheat.
Yeah, I guess I can make a few comments here, general comments about what we're looking for in a variety that is a good dual-purpose variety before Kelsey makes her comments on the disease package of Larry here. But usually, three things that we're looking for. There are several things we're looking for, but a few of them that are from a grazing perspective are, first, good forage production. And then, Stu, you mentioned Larry being a very high-yielding variety, and that helps with good forage production here in Larry. Relatively medium to late first hollow stem. So first hollow stem remembers that time in the spring when the crop takes on spring growth. The earlier it is, the less time you have the cattle has to graze in the spring. And so being that medium to medium late first hollow stem allows to graze for maybe another 10 days or so. And that might be unrelated from heading date. So it can be a late first hollow stem and early heading date variety if it just goes rapidly through that process. And then finally, that it recovers well from that stress the grazing puts on it. So trampling of plants, removal of forage, so recovery, so yielding after grazing is also quite important. So we don't generally measure that too much, with the exception of a couple of trials in Oklahoma where they're actually truly grazing these varieties. So those are good data for us to take a look at. And of course, other things that we look for, disease resistance to maybe viral diseases transmitted if you're planting early and things along those lines. Lack of good germination in hot temperatures as well. But the main are those three that I mentioned before. So I'll leave Kelsey make some comments on Larry's disease package here before I move forward.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think Stu definitely hit the highlights. Larry is susceptible to Fusarium head blight, unlike Everest. So one to watch out in years that are really favorable for disease development, like this year, for example, with a lot of water around that flowering period. And also the other key highlight is Larry's very susceptible to leaf rust. So many of the varieties are more resistant to leaf rust. So in some of these demo plots, if you walk up to Larry, that'll be the first place that you can find leaf rust. Better than average for stripe rust. So leaf rust is kind of a darker rust, and it'll be more scattered throughout the leaf, whereas stripe rust is more in orange stripes across the leaf, limited by those veins. So that's how we can tell the difference. And Larry has traditionally been better for stripe rust, but this year we're seeing some more than we would like. So that's one we're keeping an eye on for some of the population shifts. Intermediate for some of the tan spot, leaf spot diseases. So better than some, but it might be one that would require a fungicide in high disease pressure years.
All right, thank you. On to the next variety, Zenda.
So as Stu mentioned, Zenda was also released the same year that Larry was. Maybe that was about 3 years ago. And Zenda comes with a very different background from Larry. Really, it's more of an Everest type of variety there. It in fact has Everest on its background. And so it comes to kind of replace some of those acres that are currently planted to Everest there. It is a medium early maturing variety, so it's going to be a few days later than what we have in Everest, which is an early one. It's also more of a medium tall variety. So it's going to be a couple, 2 or 3 inches taller than what we have in Everest as well. But Zenda has an excellent standability, so very good straw strength. We've done some intensive management trials where some of the other varieties were lodging really bad, and Zenda was still holding up. Although that photo there on the left kind of shows that it can go down as well, especially under very high fertility conditions, like this plot there that was treated with manure quite often and heavy storms. But maybe if you go there a few days, it might be standing up back again. Overall, it has a pretty good standability. So I think it's kind of an obvious choice if Everest has worked well for you. This one that's been a pretty stable variety as far as yield goes, yield stability, good yielding variety with good yield stability as well. Kelsey, from a disease perspective, what are the similarities that we have with Everest here and differences?
Yeah, so one of the things that makes Zenda a bit better on the disease side is that it has maybe similar or even better Fusarium head blight. So it's kind of that on par with some of the best that's available right now in the lineup for Fusarium head blight. So that makes Zenda particularly good. And Zenda is better for leaf rust and stripe rust. So we see kind of what we want to see as plant pathologists, right? If you want to have some of that disease resistance right in your seed, is just a very good disease package. So we see Zenda outperform others for some of those leaf spot diseases. One of the watchouts would be for wheat streak mosaic. So in some parts of the state, that's one watch out, but overall, it's a very, very good disease package, I think. So comparable to Zenda, but to Everest, but I think a little better in some of the categories. So it's one we're excited about as pathologists, at least.
I would like to point out that all of the signs in both plots are the same height. So the way I take the pictures is I try to leave them there at that height so we can kind of see the height differences between varieties. And some of that will show up better in some later pictures. But I thought I'd throw that in on there. So our next variety.
Another thing you've got is you can see the difference in the maturity of the plots from that's really good. I appreciate seeing both of those in there to see what that 2.5 week planting date differential is.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, on to Canmark.
Yeah, and just to follow up on Tony's comment on the height there, you can already see the Canmark is going to be a little bit shorter type of variety than what we're seeing in Zenda, right? And you can see that the sign is considerably kind of above the canopy there compared to Zenda, which was at the canopy level there. So maturity-wise, Canmark has been around for a little bit longer time. I believe it was 2016 that it was released. It gained some acres in central Kansas. It's more of a variety that brings a good drought tolerance to the table. So as we go to western Kansas, sometimes we see more acres of Canmark. Some growers love it and have been growing it, and it's very successful. But it hasn't taken as many acres as some of the other varieties around. So some things about Canmark here: it's a medium maturity variety. It has a pretty decent drought tolerance that allows it to kind of move out west. It has a pretty decent straw strength as well, as you can see in the photo there. Not really lodging. Pretty good yield stability as well, kind of like a workhorse type of variety that's pretty stable yield wise. But because of that, some of the intensive trials that we had, again, because of that straw strength, it can actually take some higher rates of nitrogen and still yield quite well. Now, Stu, maybe I'll be a little bit concerned with the acid soils for the Dickinson County region on Canmark. What do you think?
I would agree, Romulo, and it has performed pretty well on those fields. And the only way you're going to know whether you've got acid tolerance or not, or aluminum tolerance, is by soil testing. And I know I was running some soil tests in for Tony last week. And I hope they didn't bake out in the box, but I couldn't get into the building or into the to the lab at that time. But yeah, Canmark doesn't like those lower pHs, and Romulo, you mentioned once they get below 5.5, and some of these varieties are even more sensitive than that. I think you don't see it, but except when you don't harvest it, it doesn't go across the scales. And I know with this. The plot on the right down at Harris's, they had some, I believe they had some phos in the starter band, so that can help, but that's a Band-Aid. But you know, and another thing I always remember with Canmark, you could spot that thing from the highway if you were doing 70, because you can roll it all the way to the end of the season. And I remember the breeder Alan was concerned because it didn't look like there was much there, but there was a lot of wheat in those heads. So, but it is a little more upright. Right, and this is one that you can use it as a marker in your plot, Tony. It'll be standing straight up. If it goes over, it's had real problems out there. So
now, Eric, there's some interesting things about the disease side here, right? A little bit different from some of the others.
Yeah, I think so. So Canmark is kind of interesting. It represents one of the outcomes of a breeding effort that's been going on at K-State for a long time on trying to breed a little more durable resistance to leaf rust, stripe rust. And so it contains in its background some wheat lines that are coming out of a international breeding organization called CIMMYT that carry forward this type of resistance. So that leaf rust resistance has been fairly stable and moderately resistant still on the leaf rust, even though Canmark is getting some age to it here. But it's never been quite enough to hold the stripe rust in check, and that's probably been Canmark's weakness over the years, may limited some of its utility throughout the state. And in a big stripe rust year, we may are still likely to benefit from a fungicide application. Canmark's also quite vulnerable to powdery mildew, some of the leaf spotting diseases, and fusarium head blight. So maybe overall a little bit weaker on the full disease package, but some interesting resistance here on the leaf rust side of things.
All right, so I think we're moving on to, got one more kind of oddball variety in here, Paradise.
Yeah, so Paradise, it's a variety that has been actually licensed to Polanski seed there in Belleville, right? It's been around for a couple of years. We have had the chance to see it for 2 or 3 years in K-State trials. In central Kansas, it has had kind of like a variable yield record there. In some years stopping some of the trials, and other trials kind of being towards the bottom there. We're still kind of trying to understand where this one's really going to be a good fit around the state. So the yield record has been a little bit more variable there than kind of what we like to see. Looks kind of like that 4458 type of head there. It's a medium early variety, medium height. Seems to do well on acid soils there as well. We can see a little bit of a lodging going on in that left picture there. I think that may be some of the reasons why in our intensive trials we didn't do as well some of the other ones. Perhaps we had some lodging in those trials. But Kelsey, I think perhaps some of these years that we had scab might have been the ones that Paradise didn't do as well either, right?
Yeah, so Paradise is a little more susceptible, especially when you compare it to Zenda or Everest that we just looked at, more susceptible to Fusarium head blight. So again, if planted after corn or in these high disease pressure years, you might need a fungicide. Paradise is holding up pretty well to stripe rust. So compared to some of the others, we've seen it maybe slip a little bit, or we've seen some fields where there's higher stripe rust than we would expect. But overall, Paradise has a pretty good leaf rust package. So for leaf rust, stripe rust, and then stem rust. And I think, one watch out might be, again, wheat streak mosaic. So there might be a little more susceptibility there. But otherwise, Fusarium head blight is, I think, the big watch out for Paradise when it comes to disease.
Thank you. Our next group are going to be the West bred group of wheat varieties we have here, starting with Grainfield.
Yeah, so Grainfield is one that has been around for several years now. 2012 was its release. And whenever we think of Grainfield, it's one of the varieties that has one of the widest adaptabilities around the state of Kansas. So quite widely adapted. It has a pretty decent drought tolerance that allows it to go out west. And it has enough acid soil tolerance. It's not the best acid soil tolerance around, but it has enough of it that kind of does well in most of central Kansas as well. Maturity-wise, Grainfield is going to be more of a medium to medium late heading, but it goes through the grain filling period quite fast, and so it finishes more of it as a medium early variety. And so, and again, it all depends what you're comparing to. As we go to the west part of the state, Grainfield becomes more of a medium to medium early variety, and in central Kansas, it's more of a medium, perhaps even a medium late, comparatively to the other varieties that we have around it. You can see their height; it's a medium tall variety as well. It has a decent straw strength. It's not the best straw at all, but it's okay for most yield levels. Although we're seeing there a considerable level of lodging in that left hand picture there. So it shows you that in very high fertility conditions, it can also lodge and have some problems there. The yield on this one comes from large head, so it's a pretty long head. Many times I've seen up to 40 kernels in that head or so a pretty good, pretty large and nice head size there. Again, it's one that has a decent yield record, and I'll still kind of keep it there more or less in the short list, and I like it better as we move more like western from Dickinson County, probably Saline County, Ellsworth County, and west, but still I've seen it yield quite well in this more central and east central part of the state there. Now, Eric, we probably need to be watching out for the disease package on this one, correct?
I think so. Over the years, we've had a lot of chances to see Grainfield over the years kind of mature as a variety, really continue to perform well a little bit west of Dickinson County. A lot of growers seem to like it. In many years, we've seen some stripe rust, leaf rust really get the better of Grainfield. So this is one because of those rust disease vulnerabilities that, again, may require a fungicide. It's also not very strong on the barley yellow dwarf, Fusarium head blight diseases either. So there are some disease vulnerabilities we need to keep an eye on if we're going to try to go after the broad adaptability and yield potential of a variety like Grainfield.
(4303).
So WB 4303, we have had the chance again to see these for a good 3 years or so in central Kansas. It has a very good yield record. especially in those conditions when not the trials that we had intensive management, for example. In many of those trials, it ended up kind of stopping the trial. So excellent yield potential on 4303. Some of the things that make it kind of good adaptation for that, for those systems where it's intensively managed, is extremely good straw strength. So very good standability there. That straw strength, I mean, I don't think I've seen 4303 really go down, and we can kind of see that in the left picture there, where Grainfield was really lodged. 4303 is standing, just excellent standability there. Medium early maturity for heading, although it's the opposite of Grainfield. It's a medium early for heading, and it goes through the Grainfield period a little bit more slowly, right? This is one that has that type of large seed size as well. We kind of want to watch out for our seeding rates if we're planting in pounds per acre. Again, mostly because it has a large seed size there. As we move out west, it's a better variety under irrigation, but in central Kansas, under intensive management, it has yielded quite well. Now, Kelsey, that intensive management many times kind of tells us that probably we might be needing a foliar fungicide there, right?
Yeah, definitely. So if we can compare WB 4303 to Westbred Grainfield, I think the disease packages are pretty similar. So they're both pretty susceptible to most of our major diseases that we think about. So WB 4303 is very susceptible to stripe rust. So if you start to see stripe rust show up in the field, that might be an indication that you would need a fungicide application, and also very susceptible to Fusarium head blight. So in a year like this year, that might make a fungicide application worthwhile. So overall, to get the maximum yield potential out of this variety, you might need that extra input, especially in disease-conducive conditions.
$44.58.
Stu, you've seen 4458 a few times, haven't you?
Absolutely. It's this has been one of our standards up the Central Corridor the last few years. Starting to slip in some popularity. It is a variety that handled drought really well. It stood well. It's kind of a medium maturity, maybe a little earlier. You can see a little bit of coloring going on on the right, but it's another one of those large seeded varieties we talk about too, Romulo. I think handles acid pH. Just was a really good yielder. It was one of the standard checks that Dr. Fritz ran in our variety trials for several years. It just was one of the most popular varieties in the state and through that area, Dickinson County. Good fall tillers, grazer. It has some overly in its background, so we got into some of the issues we got into with overly. It's still a very good yielder if you're prepared to make a fungicide application later in the season for disease control. And I'll leave the diseases up to Eric or Kelsey, but I've still always liked this one, and it gives you a chance to invest some more money in your varieties later in the season.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. The WB 4458 has been a nice yielding variety for a number of years. It seemed like it was the variety to beat in central Kansas, and a lot of the breeding programs in the region were using it as a check variety to compare modern varieties or new varieties to just before their release. Stu mentioned some disease vulnerabilities there. Probably over the years, it's been either leaf rust or Fusarium head blight. Some major susceptibilities for the 4458 that have hurt it some, and because of that, it's fallen out of favor as it's maybe some of its yield potential has slipped away in some years because of the late season diseases. We've seen a little bit more stripe rust than historically we maybe would like or have seen with the 4458, but still hanging in there reasonably well. So I say watch some of those vulnerabilities to fusarium head blight. Maybe avoid planting it in some really high-risk situations, such as planting into corn residue or wheat residue in an irrigated situation. You may still be able to get a little more mileage out of your 4458 if it's been working well for you.
So I believe the next two varieties are some new ones through Westbred. If I can get the slides to advance, there we go. 4269.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the numbering system here on Westbred with these newer ones. And the first number, number 4, just tells us that it is a hard red winter wheat, so it gives us the wheat type. The second number gives us maturity, so 2 being an early maturing variety. If this was a 6 or a 7, this would be a later maturing variety, right? Then the third number, in this case, it still did not mean anything, but starting last year, the third number started to tell us the year of release. So if you see the 4699, for example, the next one, the 6 will tell us a medium late maturing variety, and the 9 will tell us a 19 variety release. And then the last number here is just a random number generated just to give the variety a specific number there. So 4269 is a variety that is more adapted to central and eastern Kansas. It has had a very good yield record in K-State trials. So if you look at the last year or 2 years, really, the 4269 has yielded quite well. Last year, it was just behind Bob Dole there. Bob Dole was really yielding well throughout the region. So this is one that I'll keep an eye on. You know, it has had a very good yield record. It has seemed to have a decent acid soil tolerance on this one. Very good standability. You can see in that photo on the left-hand side, it's really not lodging. It's an early maturing variety, giving you that option to kind of escape the heat as well. And with that, Kelsey, it might be a good option after corn as well, isn't it?
Yeah, so this Westbred variety is better than some of the others we've discussed. So it's advertised as having that good fusarium head blight resistance, or at least it's moderately resistant. So you might see some infection, or you might see your heads that just have one of the spikelets bleached, but it's more resistant than some of the others. So that's really promising for this variety, and we see that in some of our screening tests as well. I think this one is also relatively resistant to leaf rust and stripe rust, although we're seeing a little more stripe rust in some of the USDA screening nurseries that we have here. So sometimes our ratings at Kansas State will conflict a little bit with maybe Westbred's ratings or Syngenta's ratings, and that might be because we're testing for the local populations here in Kansas, where they might have a different population that they're testing against that might be a little bit older. So we're seeing this one become a little bit more susceptible to specifically stripe rust. So that's something we're keeping an eye on. Also very susceptible to wheat streak mosaic. So better than some of the other Westbred varieties. It has that, again, kind of best in class fusarium head blight resistance and good rust resistance, but it's one to just keep an eye on disease-wise, so to make sure that you're out scouting.
Romulo, you brought up a point, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, and as we look at these two different planting dates, you talked about escaping the heat. Last Friday, when we were cutting Tony's brome, as we left, I saw cows in the pond already at before 10 o'clock in the morning. So that temperature was pretty doggone high. They were not milking very well, or they weren't eating either at that point. And at the same time, you're hurting your wheat yields. That's kind of an old indicator I got from your predecessor, who grew up on a dairy farm. It said if the cows were in the pond, he was losing wheat yield and milk. But once we get, those daytime temperatures, 75, 80 degrees, it starts hurting us. And if we've had leaf diseases on top of it, it makes it worse. But would you expand on that, please?
Sure. So actually, whenever we are above about 80 or so, the crop kind of starts to respire a lot, right? So that respiration. So remember, the crop's producing starch, producing sugars with the sunlight, right? And it's expanding sugars through respiration. So what we need is a lot of production of sugars that's going to turn into yield, and less respiration. So we have that the end difference there between how much was produced and how much was spent by that being positive, right? So whenever we start getting to 80 degrees or so, that difference starts kind of to even out, right? So there's less difference in what the plant's producing versus what it's not. And once we get above 90 or so, sometimes it completely shuts down that production. So what we're losing there in the effect of yield here is really because then the plant is putting less sugar into the grain, right? Remember, so last week I was at these plots. That plot on the left was getting to that mid-milk stage to late milk, whereas the plot on the right was actually already through that 4269, was probably that late soft dough already. So almost that yield determination was almost already done on that first, on the one on the right, whereas the one on the left was still quite a ways to go. So getting as hot as we are now in a crop that is that late is definitely going to hamper yield there, mostly because the crop is going to put less starch into that grain. So really, our grain yield is the one that is affected there. Less and more respiration, and so that ratio of how much is produced versus how much is spent goes down. So that's why we result in some higher proteins as well, because just we have less sugar, less starch going to the grain. Good question, Stu.
Well, thanks for walking us through that, because I know I wasn't very comfortable either, and as the day went along, it got worse. And
Westbred 4699.
So again, if you look at the numbers there, the 6 tells us a medium late maturing variety, and the third number, the 9, tells us a 19 release, so a release out of last year. Brand new variety out of Westbred here. As you can see, a good straw strength, good standability as well. Seems like Westbred is working pretty hard in that trait, which is excellent. Nobody really likes to harvest wheat, pick wheat out of the ground when we're harvesting it. So that's a pro for this variety, definitely having a pretty good standability. Offers you medium to medium late maturity for those acres after corn, as well as Kelsey is going to comment here with us here in just a little bit. Now, one of the concern with this one, again, the area of adaptation for this one is again I-35 and east, so it's more of a central and east and eastern Kansas type of variety. But some of our screenings on acid soil, it has shown quite intermediate there to susceptible. So not one that you want to put in your low pH sites. With that said, Kelsey probably another option to go after corn, but on the late maturity side.
Yeah, good fusarium head blight. So a good option after corn, or if you've had fusarium head blight pressure in the past. Also, fairly just overall good disease package. So better than some of the other Westbred varieties that we've seen. It's another one where Westbred reports a bit of I think a better stripe rust package than maybe what we've been seeing lately locally in some of the plots here in Kansas. So that's something to keep an eye on. That some of that stripe rust resistance may be slipping for this variety. But I think overall a good powdery mildew package, a good tan spot, septoria package. So overall this variety should have cleaner leaves when compared to some of the others in the plot. So I think that's a big positive for 4699.
So I believe this was the last of our Westbred varieties, so we'll move into a couple other ones. LCS Chrome.
So LCS Chrome, this so we had a later maturing variety 4699, and this one is another one that fits that category as well, a later maturing variety. That's my main concern with Chrome. Really, I like some of the things on agronomics for Chrome, but the maturity kind of worries me a little bit because it can be considerably later than some of the other varieties in the trial there. Things that I like about Chrome, they standability as well. Usually it's on that above average side, although it doesn't really looks like that in this plot here. But usually it does have a pretty decent straw strength. It has a good acid soil tolerance. It has a good drought tolerance. So it's another one of those varieties that, just like we talked about in Grainfield, has a wide adaptability around the state. With that concern, the caveat that that late maturity can hurt it sometimes. Again, kind of getting caught on the heat, right? I mean, when other varieties might be already finishing grain field, this one might still be in the middle of that grain filling period, and so might get caught in the heat. And again, that heat stress might hurt yields towards later in the season there. But Eric, Chrome has been one that has done quite well as far as disease goes, correct, over the years?
Yeah, I think so. Chrome has kind of been an interesting one on the disease side of things. It does have some nice resistance to some of the leaf spotting diseases, which has been a big plus for it as well. Maybe where its leaf rust resistance has been hanging in there really well, so we've been pleased to see that. Maybe where it struggled or we have a little bit of concern would be on the Fusarium head blight side of things. I think Lima Grain feels it's a little more resistant there than some of the observations that I've been able to make over the years. Maybe a little more susceptible on the barley yellow dwarf side and some of the K-State tests as well. So there are a few things that we want to keep an eye out on LCS Chrome. This is one, like Kelsey mentioned at the beginning of the program, that has some, appears to be emerging vulnerability to stripe rust. So we've seen a few places in central Kansas now where we've seen more stripe rust than we maybe like to. I think this is one where we're going to see its resistance rating slip from moderately resistant, maybe to the intermediate, maybe even moderately susceptible. We'll kind of see where it falls out here at the end of the year. So if LCS Chrome is working for you, as you like to try and mix up your maturity on your wheat that you plant, it's okay to stick with it, but I would keep an eye on it if we get into stripe rust over the next couple of years.
So I think we're going to finish up with our Syngenta varieties. We got a few more of those in here.
Very well. Bob Dole being the very first one. So this is a variety that, as Tony mentioned, it was licensed to Syngenta, although originally it was a K-State product. So it was bred by Kansas State University and then licensed out to Syngenta, AgriPro. So Bob Dole has had an excellent yield record. So in 2017, it didn't do as well as some of the other ones. Remember, it had a very prolonged drought that year, and that hurt it a little bit. So its drought tolerances for that early spring drought has hurt it in the past. But then in 2018, which was maybe a little bit later drought there, and 2019, it had excellent yield record. So it seems like that early drought might slaughter some feelers off of it, and that's what hurt it in 2017. But 2018 and 2019, it had an excellent yield record. Really, last year, it was topping many of our trials in the central corridor of the state. So it's one that really very rapidly came to the short list of many of the growers around the state after seeing those results. It has a very good yield potential, as we saw it last year. Good on acid soils. It is a tall variety, so we need to be cognizant of that. It's going to be taller than the majority of the other varieties in that plot, or majority of the other varieties that are available, really. But it usually has above average straw strength. Now, that means that combination of being tall and not being an excellent straw strength, just being an above average, we can see sometimes what you're seeing there on the left-hand side, which is showing some lodging if the conditions are extremely high yielding. But this is another one that you can also take a look into some extra profit there and like commercializing it not only based on yield but based on quality as well. Has excellent quality profile in the grain, so sometimes a little premium there on the protein, or even better the actual quality itself on some of those niche programs. So that will be one that I'll be considering very, very strongly in those situations. But this one has a large seed size, so just be aware of that as well. Whenever you're putting your seeding rate together, just consider its seed size. Kelsey, what about disease package on Bob Dole? What are we seeing this season?
I think Bob Dole has a good disease package. I think we've seen a little more stripe rust again. It's been a high stripe rust year, so but overall, it's compared to others very, very good for stripe rust, leaf rust, and stem rust. Also good for septoria and tan spot. So like I just mentioned for the last variety, this variety seems to have cleaner leaves in general, even when we have high disease pressure in plots. Key vulnerability, powdery mildew. So I think even in this, we were visiting this plot here on the left, and there was high powdery mildew pressure. So that's something to watch out for, especially in kind of high yield environments, nice and cool and wet, densely packed canopies. You might see more powdery mildew. And also wheat streak mosaic and barley yellow dwarf might show up in Bob Dole more than you would see in other varieties. So those virus diseases are some key vulnerabilities. But overall, a good disease package, a good option, especially if you're going for that high quality and high yielding variety.
All right, moving on to the next one, we have Wolverine.
So SY Wolverine is a brand new release from the AgriPro program there. It's actually we saw it last year. I think it was the first time that we saw it, and it was 2019 release. So it has both Wolf and Everest on the background. Some of the things that we've seen with Wolverine so far, right? So we're still kind of learning about this one, but pretty good standability. Usually it seems to stand quite well, as you can see in that photo to the left side there. Maturity, I'm still trying to find out where this one is going to fit. I mean, I've seen it being quite late for heading, but I've seen it being more on that medium early side for grain feeling, and so I'm really wanting to see it more time so I can actually really place it where it's going to fit as far as maturity goes. Because remember, Wolf was a medium late one and Everest was an early one, and so I'm kind of wondering where this one's going to be. Perhaps it has some photoperiod sensitivity as well. That's why we're seeing some difference in maturity there. But again, I've seen both sides. I've seen it being on that medium late side for heading, and I've seen it being on the medium early for grain feeling. So I need to see this more time before I can really be more definitive there on its maturity. One thing that we want to avoid with Wolverine is low pH soils. It does not handle it quite very well. So unfortunately, we got that trait from Wolf and not from Everest. So it's one that we need to be cognizant of that. So probably more of a central and western variety type of variety here rather than central and east. So probably for Dickinson County, we might have better options there. But Eric, what are we learning this year from Wolverine, from the disease package?
Yeah, we've just been able to get some of our own disease observations on it just this year, so things are kind of taking shape for us as well. Maybe we've seen a little more vulnerability to stripe rust than we'd like for a fairly new variety. I mean, that's nothing too surprising given Everest vulnerability and Wolf's vulnerabilities, two of its parents. So I think we're going to need to watch that on Wolverine. Interestingly, it's still hanging in there quite well, moderately resistant to leaf rust, so that's been encouraging. It's the other thing we're curious about would be how well Wolverine stood up to some of the leaf spotting diseases like tan spot and septoria. And the reason is, remember, Wolf, one of its parents, is a variety that was known to have better than average resistance to the leaf spotting diseases. And from some of our preliminary observations, I'm encouraged there. I feel like maybe we are seeing some evidence that Wolverine is going to bring some of that leaf spotting disease resistance forward, which could give it some a little more utility and wheat type of acreage. On Fusarium head blight, barley yellow dwarf, I don't think Wolverine's going to be anything special. So I think we're going to have to keep an eye on those vulnerabilities. So few vulnerabilities to keep your eye on. I'm mostly concerned about that stripe rust susceptibility. So let's give Wolverine a chance, use a fungicide if we need to, and see where this takes us.
Thank you for that. Monument.
So SY Monument, Stu, we mentioned quite a bit about the double cropping wheat after soybeans there, and this one seems to be one that growers like about it. So what do you think about Monument, Stu? What are your take on this variety?
Well, the growers do have liked this one. It's if not the top variety in the state, it's been one of the top 2 or 3 for several years. That one and Grainfield both. A lot of good tillering ability in the fall. So I mean, whether you're double cropping late or going for grazing early, it seems to be a really good all around wheat and pretty good drought tolerance. It tends to, if you overmanage it, it may lean a little bit. It's still got a pretty good straw strength on it as the most part, but it's kind of a medium height, and again, one of those medium, or maybe an early medium to medium maturity, but it's been just really solid in that central part of the state and even further west a little bit. A really nice fit, does well, fits well on the pH side of things, and has been a really good yielder. It's just had a lot of good qualities, and it's made it a really solid wheat for our growers. I'd have some, except for my farms in Osage County, and it'd just fall apart. Everything falls apart in Osage County.
What about its disease package, Kelsey? What are we seeing this year with Monument?
Yeah, I think probably one of the reasons that it performs really well is that it has a good disease package, particularly when we're talking about leaf rust, stripe rust, hand spot, powdery mildew. So again, the leaves of this variety will look very clean even in a high disease pressure situation. Now, this year, however, we're looking at some of our data and some of the visits that we've been doing to field sites, and we're seeing more stripe rust again, like we were for Chrome on SY Monument. So it's something to keep an eye on now. So if it's historically, you have not had to use a fungicide to control stripe rust on SY Monument, that might be a concern moving forward. Another key just red flag for SY Monument is it is susceptible to Fusarium head blight. So it's something, if planted after corn and in a year where the weather is conducive, it might need a fungicide application to kind of control that Fusarium head blight issue. But other than that, still looking like a solid disease package overall.
So on to our last variety, and that is SY Benefit.
Yeah, so SY Benefit, we've seen it for at least 3 years now. It was released as a variety that would be better adapted to I-35 and East, so kind of like a central and eastern variety there, with a decent low pH tolerance. So that is a trait that we look for in that part of the state as well. Also, I believe they were mentioning Benefit having a little bit better scab tolerance than average, so probably Eric can talk to us about that here in a little bit. The main thing, we haven't really seen Benefit yield as well in our trials as some of the other varieties. So even in central Kansas, if we look at its yield record for the last 3 years or so, it has been kind of towards that the lower end. And so although I think it might have some characteristics of interest there as like an earlier maturing variety, it's an early to medium early variety there, good milling and baking characteristics on Benefit, good acid soil tolerance. Just the yield record just isn't very solid. It's been basically towards the bottom, and that concerns me, of course, because at the end of the day, yield is what growers are looking for. But Eric, any comments there on Benefit's disease package?
Well, I would agree that I think Benefit has struggled a little bit over the years. Probably the thing that Syngenta really liked about it at the beginning was its adaptation for eastern Kansas, they felt, and then also some intermediate levels of resistance to Fusarium head blight. So I'm encouraged overall that we're getting more and more varieties that have intermediate to moderately resistant reactions to Fusarium head blight. But I think out of our lineup, I might choose something like the Zenda or 4269 out of the Westbred program over the SY Benefit, just because of their more consistent yield performance. SY Benefit, we've seen really get hit hard by leaf rust in a couple years now, and also a little bit weaker on some of the other foliar diseases. So I think there may be some better things even within that Syngenta lineup for you to consider for this portion of the state.
All right. Thank you for that. That was our last variety. So if we have any more comments from anybody on here or questions. Stu, do you have anything to add, or are you good?
I'm good to go. It's we just need to, I think Romulo, we're probably going to see some test weight dings here on some of the stuff that came a little later, but we'll see what happens. That means high protein, right?
Yeah, definitely with this heat that we had last week, and today's supposed to be pretty hot as well. I believe on the 9th of June, we're supposed to be a little bit cooler there. So hopefully that helps a little bit. But yeah, I'm thinking that we lost some yield already, and we're actually calculating the number of hours that we had above those stretch now, so we can put a short article together on that for growers. So.
Tony, you guys are expecting rain tomorrow, or there's pretty good chances for rain tomorrow night. Is that correct? I think I'd look like the central part of the state. That's going to cool it off some, but there are some areas that, especially those later planted, I think we could still use some moisture. We're getting starting to get a little short on Romulo. Is that what you've been seeing too? It would not hurt to have another shot of water.
Yeah, I think, as we go to south central Kansas, southwest Kansas, the crop's pretty much getting to where it's not going to benefit. And by that, I mean like Sumner County region. At least I was there last week, and I was giving it 5-6 days before the combines were going to roll in that part of the state. So we're probably not going to see any yield benefit in that situation. But I've seen some fields in McPherson County that were still in that mid-grain feeling that rainfall could still benefit. So from there north, and west, especially, some rainfall could still benefit yields there. So definitely, if we had some now on the 9th, that would be quite beneficial.
It's a big turnaround from last year, because about this time last year, our office was surrounded by sandbags in preparation for potential flooding. And now we're asking for some rain. So big change from last year. Well, if that's all we have, I'd like to thank all of you for joining me this morning to record our wheat plot tour. And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, and Romulo,
Thank you.
getting this organized.
Thanks, Tony.
And everybody else.